do every so often at appropriate meetings with the Your College meeting is to invite guest speakers who can share experience or expertise or their insights on a particular event that is occurring in the calendar. And this week, as I'm sure everybody is aware, we have a particularly significant event in the calendar, which is Holocaust Memorial Day on this Thursday. And so I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by Agnes Grunwald-Spier, whom Agnes and I met in slightly odd circumstances, actually, but it was a wonderful experience in Oradea in Romania, and Agnes can say a little bit more about that if she wishes. But I was in Romania. I met Agnes at the airport. We shared a flight back together back to the UK. We got chatting, and we've really stayed in touch ever since. And we have an open invitation to Agnes to come and speak in the Great Minds series at the university. But of course, this year we decided that the risk was probably still too great to invite her in person to come to the university. So instead, Agnes very kindly agreed to come and speak to this meeting, to the All College meeting, and well, you'll see what Agnes has got to say. It's a great story. I'm not going to propose to do anything else this afternoon in the meeting. I'd like to make sure we have the meeting set aside and dedicated to Agnes's presentation to us. So I'm not going to say much more because Agnes can, of course, you can introduce yourself, and I don't want to get in the way of your presentation. But I'd just like to say how personally honoured I am to have you joining us today, Agnes. It was relatively short notice. I'm so pleased that you're able to. And you know, in particular, I think it's a really appropriate way of marking such an important event in the calendar. So I think without further ado, colleagues, by the way, I should say also, and Agnes, I'm sure you'll be very happy with this, we'll allow you to present. Colleagues, do pop things into the chat. I think Agnes has prepared something which will last about maybe 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, Agnes. So
we shall see.
We'll see how we get on.
Yes.
But we have an hour slot available, so there may be a little bit of time towards the end if anybody has any particular questions of anything that you've presented. So Agnes, if that's okay, I shall hand over and let you take the floor, as it were. Agnes.
Thank you very much, Craig. Well, this talk was meant to happen last year, and COVID got in the way, and it's got in the way again. But we are not defeatist, and so here we are. And I should point out the old adage about old dogs and new tricks. This is the first time I've done a Zoom presentation, particularly with a PowerPoint. So if it's successful, I shall think I'm awfully clever. Well, all good stories start with a wedding, and this was my parents in Budapest on the 23rd of March, 1942. I come from a Hungarian family. At the time, you'll all be aware, the war was waging all round, but Hungary hadn't been occupied by the Germans, although it had had its own anti-Jewish legislation since the 30s. So my parents got married then, and I think they both looked quite glum. Whether they had any idea of what was going to happen, I don't know, but I will tell you their stories separately because their stories are completely different and not within the norm of usual Holocaust stories. My mother was the eldest of 4 girls, and I put this picture in not because it really has any relevance to the story, but I just think it's really cute. And my mother was the eldest. There are about 7 years, I think, between her and the youngest. And even right at the end of her life, she was still complaining about the fact that they all had to wear the same outfits. And she really thought, as the eldest, it was a bit infra-dig. But I think those bows are really cute. And I only had sons, so I didn't have the chance to do anything like that. This is my mother with her family. My mother is on the extreme right. And as you can see, it's my grandparents' 20th wedding anniversary. Next to her is her father, Armin. And the tall girl next to him is Clara, who was quite important in my life. And then there's Ergie, who's the little one, their mother, Rosa, and Ibi, who was the third daughter, who was the last one to die. Armin, well, Rosa died in 1941 in hospital. She was quite a sickly woman, and it was nothing to do with the war or the Holocaust. Armin carried on, obviously, afterwards, but when the Germans occupied Hungary, which they did in March 1944, one day he was on a bus and the bus was stopped by the Nazis, and they came on and they said, "Are there any Jews on the bus?" And you couldn't deny you were a Jew unless you had false documents, because your papers had a great big red J. So he was taken off the bus and taken away. I'm quite cynical about the Hungarians because of what happened to my family, but the bus driver recognized him, and he must have been a really decent man, because when he finished his shift, he went round to the family and told them what he'd seen. Armin was never seen again by the family, and after the war, they found he'd been taken to Auschwitz. And I should imagine he was probably gassed on arrival, because I've not been able to find a number for him, and you only got a number if they decided that you were fit to work, and he had been quite a sickly man. Fairly recently, I discovered that he'd been with his brother, I think it was called something like Gula, when they were taken away. And in a bizarre sort of way, I found that a little bit comforting, really, because I thought, well, at least he wasn't on his own, and whatever they had to face, they probably faced together. This is the tombstone in Budapest, which was put up for their mother, as you can see, and then after the war, they added their father's name. This, as you can see, it's me with my parents in 1946. I'm not sure about the tambourine. My mother was extremely musical. I am not. And I assume that it was something that the photographer had in a pile of toys that gave the little darlings to keep them quiet. I certainly didn't pursue my career with the tambourine. So there are my mother and father in after the war, and looking at them, you would have absolutely no idea of the trauma that they'd both been through to get to that day. I'll tell you about my father first. My father was taken away in 1943, and I'd like you to remember that, because, as I said, it's before Germany occupied Hungary. He was taken away as a forced labourer by the Hungarians, and the forced labourers were treated incredibly badly. Very few of them actually came back. He did come back. He was extremely embittered by his experiences and by what his fellow natives, had done to him. And after the war, when my parents were settled in this country, my mother would have liked to have had more children because she was one of 4, but my father wouldn't have any more children. He said it wasn't a world to bring children into. And so I don't have any siblings, which now I really feel I'm missing out as you get older. And in fact, when I was 10 in 1955, he committed suicide. So I always think that he was a survivor, but he wasn't really, because his life after the war was not what he would have expected. And my mother said that he felt the world owed him something. So my mother was left in Budapest on her own when he was taken away. And bizarrely, he was allowed home on leave from the labour camp, which I've never really got to the bottom of. But that was apparently when I was conceived. And So she found herself in June of 1944 having to leave her flat and move into what they called the Star of David house, where they kept the women, Jewish women were put. It wasn't yet the ghetto, but I don't think there was a great deal of choice about it. And then in July 1944, I was born, and she went to a special clinic. She couldn't go to the maternity hospital because she was Jewish. And then she went back to the Star of David house. Now, my mother didn't go in for elaborate stories, so she was very vague about all this. What she told me was that sometime after I was born and before November 1944, when we went to the ghetto, she was told she had to report the next day. I don't know how much she knew of what was going on, but she was fearful enough to try and leave me with my paternal grandmother. But as my mother was breastfeeding me, my grandmother wouldn't have been able to feed me. So in the end, she went with me in her arms the next morning. And all she ever said about it was that the man in charge sent back the women with children. She never said who the man was. And at the time, I wasn't curious enough to ask. So I don't know whether he was a German. I don't know whether he was a Hungarian police or soldier. He could even have been a Jew, because the Nazis, as I'm sure you all know, were very adept at getting the Jews and the Jewish councils, which they set up to do their dirty work. Anyhow, but for him, I certainly wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now. And so she went back to where she'd been, and then in November we were sent to the ghetto, and we were liberated from the ghetto on the 18th of January 1944. The Hungarian ghetto is very unusual in that it really only existed for 3 months, when you, which is important when you compare it with somewhere like the Warsaw ghetto, which existed for several years. But it wasn't a good place to be. As you probably know, Budapest has the most awful winters. It was bitterly cold, and there wasn't any fuel, and there wasn't any food. And also the Arrow Cross, the Hungarian fascists, liked to take pot shots at the Jews in the ghetto. So it wasn't a good place to be. My mother amazingly managed to breastfeed me all through, even though she had very little to eat. And in fact, she said to me afterwards, when she went back to her flat, I was such a bonny looking child. Everybody said, oh, the ghetto couldn't have been so bad. Look at that child. So there we are. Anyhow, I'm researching a family memoir, and I'm trying to find out what exactly happened when the ghetto was liberated. But she went back to her flat, which they didn't own, was rented, but somehow, I don't know whether somebody else had been living in it in these 6 months or so that she hadn't been there. She went back, and the Russian soldiers who liberated Budapest were roaming around and causing havoc. There was a rape and pillage and all the usual stuff going on. And although my mother found 3 Russian soldiers in her flat, she was very short, but she had great presence, and they wanted food, and she indicated to them she hadn't got any food. So they disappeared, and they came back with a frozen animal, which she reckons was a dog. And somehow it got hacked up, and somehow she cooked it. I mean, my mother was an excellent cook, but she didn't have the opportunity to prove it on that occasion. And then when they'd had something to eat, they all lay on the floor and went to sleep. And she could hear in the block of flats women screaming and dinner services flying through the window and all sorts. But her Russian soldiers just lay down and went to sleep. And in the morning they pushed off. So that was my little mum and the Russian soldiers. I think Anthony Beauvoir has written a book about what happened in Berlin, which tells you what went on. So in March 1945, my father came back. And again, I'm trying to find out how he came back. I certainly don't think there was a row of nice shiny coaches waiting to take them home. And my mother had made up her mind that if she survived the Holocaust, she would leave Hungary because of the anti-Semitism. And she called me Agnes because although it's a popular name in Hungary, she knew it was an international name. She wanted to come to England because Clara, the second girl, had come here before the war. My father wanted to go to Palestine, to what would become Israel, but my mother won that one. And so we fled to Vienna round about the time that this photograph was taken. And we were there for a year whilst the paperwork was sorted out. Clara acted as a guarantor. You had to have someone who would guarantee that you wouldn't be a drain on the state. And we arrived in England in May 1947. Oh, I just put this in for interest. Jews weren't allowed to have radios after the Germans occupied Budapest. So you can see this is the receipt that my father received. It says Grunwald Philipp, which is its name in Hungarian, and Kapla, 8 Kapla Utsa, which was where they lived. And apparently the radio was worth 200 forints, I suppose, which apparently meant it was quite a good radio. I've often wondered whether I could go back and claim my radio, but I doubt whether that would work. Yes, so galloping on through history, you know, I grew up in England. I had an excellent education, having been successful in the 11 plus, and eventually I got married, and eventually, and I mean eventually because we were married for 10 years before we had any children. I had my eldest son, and then followed, not quickly, but 3 yearly intervals by 2 others. So that's really fortunate. So this is my eldest son, looking rather soulful, but at his wedding in September 2008, just outside Manchester. We're looking fairly solemn because on the extreme right-hand side, you can just see a white document, and you can't see the rabbi except his hand, I think, and he's reading the ketubah, which is the Hebrew wedding certificate, and it outlines the duties of the husband and the wife, and it goes on a bit. And we're all looking quite solemn, trying to pretend that we understand what's being said, but we didn't. But anyhow, it was a traditional Jewish wedding, as has happened for centuries. So this is my ex-husband and my 3 sons, and obviously the one in the white dress is the bride, a bit of a giveaway, and me. And I always say that I had my hat specially made for the wedding, and I've never worn it since, and so it's nice for it to get an airing. But there is actually a more serious reason for showing you this photograph, because if you remember the man who sent back my mother because she had a child, but for him, there might have been a wedding in north of Manchester on that date, but the only people there would have been my ex and the bride. And I think it's very important for people to understand, because most people know, although actually the statistics do tell us otherwise, that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust. But what they don't think about is the generations that would have come from those people who were murdered. So this is me with my second granddaughter, Ava. And I particularly took this photograph when she was 6 months old, because I was 6 months old when we were liberated from the ghetto. And particularly when I talk to schools, it shows them how vulnerable a 6-month-old baby and how amazing it was that my mother was able to feed me and keep me warm and safe all through that really difficult time. So this is the family in 2019 when I celebrated my 75th birthday. Since then, we've had an addition. Yes, so this was taken in December at Chanukah, and you can see the very welcome addition is Monty sitting on my eldest son's knee. He wouldn't pose unless Daniel held him. Daniel was looking spectacularly seedy, having celebrated his 43rd birthday the day before. But they're eating chocolate coins, and it's traditional to give children chocolate coins at Chanukah, as though they don't have enough chocolate all the time anyhow, but there we go. Fortunately, I survived when 1.5 million Jewish children did not survive the Holocaust. And I've been blessed to have had a family and 4 grandchildren. And my youngest son got engaged over Christmas. So hopefully there will be more to come. So all I ever knew about the Holocaust was what my mother told me. And that is really what I've told you now. But when my sons were teenagers, I was very conscious of the fact that I didn't really know much. And I was living in Sheffield at the time. And as I was pondering this problem, somebody told me that they were doing a master's in Holocaust Studies at Sheffield University. And so I signed up and did that in my mid-50s, which was great. I mean, I thoroughly enjoyed it and I learned so much. And in effect, it changed my life because as a result, I had to write a dissertation to get my degree. And I wrote about a man who was a Holocaust rescuer. And that led me to have an interest in Holocaust rescuers. And the book, The Other Schindlers, was the result of the research I did. I researched 30 different Holocaust rescuers in 10 different countries. And that book was published in 2010 when I was 65. And my life has not been the same since. I knew I liked research because I'd done local history research when I lived in a Worcestershire village. But I also discovered that I actually enjoyed writing. And people seem to think, that I write quite well and that my books are readable, even though the topic is a difficult topic. I'm just going to tell you 2 or 3 stories. The Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, which runs Holocaust Memorial Day, has a different theme each year. And the theme this year is One Day. Well, I've already told you about the day that my mother had to report and was sent back, and which in effect saved her life and mine. And the day my father came back from the labour camp, and various other significant days in my life. This woman, Leny Jacobs-Melkman, was a Dutch lady, and she was training to be a doctor, but she had to stop when the Jews were prevented from continuing to, to go to the university. And her story is quite remarkable. It was sent to me by Dan Mitchman, who's the head historian at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. And she was actually his aunt, although she died before he was born. And she was a highly intelligent woman. And I'll just have to look my notes because it's a long time since I've told her story. In October 1942, she wrote a letter to a non-Jewish colleague, At that time, she had 2 small children and she was pregnant with the third. It's a very poignant picture. You can see her with the 2 children she had, and she was pregnant with the third. And she was trying to explain her predicament to this non-Jewish colleague because she had the intelligence and the foresight to really understand that what the Germans wanted to do was destroy the Jews once and for all. And many people thought if they kept their heads down, it would pass and everything would be okay. But she was trying to decide what to do with her children and whether she should put them into hiding altogether, whether she should go with them. In the end, what she actually did was she hid all her, she left all her children, because the third one had been born by then, with different people, and all 3 children did survive. But her husband, who was involved in the medical services in Amsterdam, he was taken away and he was killed in Mauthausen on the 26th of February 1945. And Leny was arrested on the 26th of February 1945 when the baby she had was 1, and she was sent to Auschwitz and she was killed there on the 28th of January 1944, aged 33. The man who received her letter kept it in his study, and after he died, his son found it, and his son was determined to try and find the family. And he did, and he was able to hand the letter back to her children, who were obviously absolutely delighted because all they had was a few photographs. And Dan Mitchman, as I say, what he wrote to me about his aunt was he considered her exemplary in the intimation of her poignant motherly feelings. More, he indicates that Leny was already then, and much earlier than the general public, painfully aware that the purpose of the Germans was the total eradication of all Jews. The next thing I'm going to talk about is the Babi Yar massacre, which took place in Kiev. It's not one day, it's over 2 days, but I've included it because it's regarded as the deadliest single operation of the Holocaust, and 33,000 Jews were killed over 2 days. You can read the testimony of Dina, who described what happened. And it's difficult to imagine how awful it must have been for the people who'd been rounded up and had to take their clothes off. And also, I always think, well, particularly for the Orthodox Jews who have, dressed very modestly, and, at that time, to have to undress in public and so on, it must have been horrific. I mean, nowadays people are more used to going around in scantily clad clothes, but at that time it wasn't. And of course there were elderly women and so on. And she talks about hearing the cries of the panic-stricken children calling out, "Mother, mother." Now this is a little girl. She was born in 1934 in Kiev. She was 5 when this photograph was taken, and she was one of the people that was murdered at Babi Yar in September 1941. And again, you need to bear in mind that the Nazis murdered 1.5 million children simply because they'd been born to Jewish families. And this was another witness, and I will read this because I think it's terribly important. I watched what happened when the Jews, men, women, and children arrived. The Ukrainians led them past a number of different places where one after another they had to remove their luggage, then their coats, shoes, and overgarments, and also underwear. Once undressed, the Jews were led into the ravine, which was about 150 meters long and 30 meters wide and a good 15 meters deep. When they reached the bottom of the ravine, they were seized by the members of the Schutzpolizei and made to lie down on top of Jews who had already been shot. This all happened very quickly. The corpses were literally in layers. I mean, I just think that is so horrendous. And this article that I've been quoting from is on the Holocaust Memorial Day website for this HMD. So if you want to read more about it, it's there. People say, could the Holocaust happen here? I'm going to go through this quite quickly. We have the example of the Channel Islands, where people behaved much the same way as they did in the rest of occupied Europe, and they collaborated, and Jews were betrayed and Jews were sent back to Europe to be murdered. The situation with COVID has shown up again, the anti-Semitism today, where Jews have been blamed for COVID and for spreading it, and also in some of the marches in London in recent years, the Jews have been blamed for the Grenfell fire as well. I do find this quite remarkable because if we go back 700 years, the Jews were blamed for the Black Death and for poisoning the wells, and we don't seem to have made a lot of progress in 700 years, which is disappointing to say the least. I just included this figure on the first day of the Somme because it is apparently the bloodiest day in British history, and apparently on that day over 19,000 British soldiers were killed and 57,000 plus were wounded. So you can compare that with the 33,000 Jews that were murdered in Kiev in September 1941. And I think it just demonstrates how determined the Nazis were to try and destroy Judaism. And the Babi Yar massacre is also important because so many people think the Holocaust happened at Auschwitz, but in fact, an enormous number of the 6 million were killed by being shot into trenches, as I've described to you. Rather, it's horrible, but I just think people need to know, particularly when people are walking around wearing yellow stars, because they're saying that what's happened with COVID is as bad as the Holocaust. As you're in Lincoln, I just thought I'd mention little Hugh, who was born in 1246 and was killed in 1255, ostensibly by the Jews of Lincoln. And he was buried in the cathedral, and apparently, looking at the pictures, you can still see the remains of the shrine. Little Hugh is one of the blood libel stories that occurred quite a bit in medieval times, but it still exists today. And they alleged that the Jews killed little Christian children because they needed the Christian blood for matzahs, for Passover, and various other ritual aspects. This is quite interesting because it displays complete lack of knowledge about Jews, because in fact, the reason why Jews eat kosher meat is because they don't eat blood, and kosher meat is salted and drained, so to get rid of the blood. So the whole thing is an absolute nonsense. But particularly with little Hugh, I found this bit about him in something called Find a Grave. So if you look up little Hugh, and apparently the Canon de Lexington of Lincoln Cathedral spread the rumor that Jews habitually ritually murdered Christian children, and he was there, and little Hugh was therefore given a burial in the cathedral. And the Jews were very badly treated. 93 were arrested, and Canon de Lexington forced a so-called confession under torture, and 18 Jews were executed, and there were fines, and it's quite a famous story. Apparently Chaucer even mentions it in the Prioress's Tale. So if you knew about Lincoln, well done. If you knew about little Hugh, well done, you should get a prize. And if you didn't, well, you've learned something else today.
Agnes, thank you so much for sharing with us your own life story and actually bringing in, which I hadn't heard you talk about before, actually bringing in some of the other stories from the Holocaust. And I mean, personally, I can't think of a better way, a more fitting way of fulfilling the original purpose of Holocaust Memorial Day, which is for us to come together and to ensure that we're remembering the terrible events of history. Of course, not just the Nazi Holocaust, but more recent Holocausts, as you've very clearly reminded us that these things can still be very close to home. So it's obviously a terrible story in many ways, but also what I was really struck by was the story of hope that you brought, and that your books also have highlighted about those who risked their lives to ensure the survival of many of those in the Holocaust, and your own one day, the day that your mother was sent away again with you in her arms, which has led to you being able to create new generations, which I think is more a story of hope as well, and that's also particularly striking. So thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Well, that's it. As I was preparing the stuff on Babi Yar, of course, that was Kiev, and you know, Kiev is very much in the news, and it's an area which has had a miserable history, really. And it's very worrying. There always seem to be people that want to rock the boat. I mean, most people just want to have a normal life, you know, have a job, have enough money, bring up their family, have a bit of a holiday, you know, go to the pub or whatever. But there are always troublemakers stirring it up and spoiling life.
Yeah, indeed, and I was particularly struck about the terrible events at Babi Yar. I mean, indeed, the Central Europe is really bloodstained, isn't it? And the suffered terrible events in the Holocaust. And in fact, I remember reading a book on it called Bloodlands, actually, which was a definition of that particular area of Central Europe. It suffered dreadfully in the eastern parts of it under Stalin, and then of course through the period of the Holocaust. It is, you've described the events of Babi Yar. It's almost impossible for us to imagine. It really is. But what we can do is make sure that we don't forget.
Yes, I didn't have time because, as you said, you know, didn't have a lot of notice. Somewhere in my system, I have got a photograph of a man with a cart selling clothes, and the clothes that the people had to take off to be shot, they were being traded almost whilst they were still warm. People were making money out of those clothes. And again, I just find it so, it's just so disgusting. And I mean, the thing that's difficult to say, but has to be said really, is that particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. I've already referred to Hungary, but Lithuania, Latvia, and so on, and Poland, there were people that helped Jews and rescued Jews, but there were also many people who were only too happy to get stuck in and join in the attacks on the Jews, and that's something which, to some extent, still exists. I remember reading only recently about an elderly couple who'd helped their neighbours during the Holocaust, and they were belatedly being given an award, and they didn't want to have it because they didn't want their neighbours to know that they'd helped Jews in the war. And you just begin to despair, really. How can we ever improve the situation? It's I do find it difficult. I look at my little grandchildren and I think, what sort of world are they going to be growing up in?
Indeed, Agnes, and you've alluded to the very deserved awards that you've received at universities. One of the things that I'm sure my colleagues will be happy for me to refer to it, but I think one of the things that really strikes me is that at university, this is kind of what we do, right? I mean, we have a very international community here. We take pride in the fact that we have a mission to create global citizenship, responsible leaders, and the process of education and the exposure of people to the other, to people who are different than ourselves, who are perhaps not necessarily the people that we've grown up with in our own communities, and the ability to work with them, understand them, learn from their cultures, has to be part of the solution. I would have thought that we can make that contribution to avoiding anything like this ever happening again in our own way, I think. I don't know whether that's your experience of university, but certainly that would be my thought on it.
Yes, I mean, when I speak at universities, I always get an amazing response, and I particularly remember when I got my honorary degree at Sheffield University. As you all know, there's one or two honorary graduates, but the bulk of the people there are just ordinary graduates with their mum and dad come to get their degree, and they don't really want to sit there in their best bib and tucker with me banging on about the Holocaust. But at the end, when I'd finished my acceptance speech, they literally all stood up and clapped, and the chap who'd organised the event, and can't remember, the public orator or whatever he was called, he said in all the years he'd been doing it, he'd never heard such a response from the students. That there was prejudice of different sorts, and I just think that's terribly important. The whole question of the other. We all tend to want to be with people who are like us, and to like people who are like us. And unfortunately, that doesn't make for a nice, safe, cozy world.
Absolutely, Agnes, and so I think that's a really, really powerful message for us, I suppose, as educators, in a sense, which is the question how we can make sure that we're continually exposing our students to not the comfortable facts of life, but sometimes the uncomfortable facts of life, like, for example, memorializing the Holocaust Day, and have them understand actually that the sort of instinctive xenophobia or fear of the other that I suppose is part of being human, actually, in some ways, it is not inconsequential. It is the start of a process of radicalization, which can lead to the horrific events that we've been talking about. And I'll remind colleagues that last year we had a great talk from Carol Glover in our chaplaincy, who was talking about her personal experience of Bosnia in 1995, so where we had very similar, not of course to the same scale, but similar conditions pertaining, and indeed is now part of the memorialization of Holocaust Memorial Day. So these things are not distant; they are close to us in society, and it behoves all of us to make sure that we're aware of and we fight against these these trends that can lead to the horrific events that we've
One of the trends that I do find worrying is this business of in universities. These students seem to be worried about anything which might be a little bit nasty or, you know, a little bit unpleasant. Well, obviously, you know, the stuff about Babi Yar is horrible. I mean, who wants to read that? But the fact of the matter is, to have any sort of understanding, you have to sort of tackle it. And that's why I just think it's so important that people understand. And when people make trivial comparisons of, you know, having to have an injection, you know, oh, it's like the Holocaust and so on, they've got no idea, absolutely no idea. And you can't, you go to university to broaden your mind. You can't live in a nice little cozy cotton wool cocoon. You need to know what's going on now, what's gone on in the past. You know, what is it? Those that don't know the lessons of history are forced to repeat them, and so on.
Indeed, thank you.
You need to know what people are capable of.
Absolutely, and thank you. That's a very powerful reminder to all of us, actually, on this meeting, that we must pay close attention to that. Sally is asking, what message should we tell our children, or do you tell your grandchildren, about being the other and getting to know the other?
I think you need to bring them up to treat everybody with respect, whoever they are, you know, their little friends and all the rest of it, and that everybody deserves to be treated equally and decently, and build it up from that, and not to have a, you know, excuse me, prejudice against other faiths, other races, and so on, and gradually build it up. I don't think there's, you know, any need to tell young children about the Holocaust, because it'll just frighten them, and there's no need.
I would love, with your permission, to continue this wonderful partnership that we've developed purely by chance, actually, a chance meeting on that plane out of Romania.
It was actually out of Hungary.
Oh, it was indeed out of Hungary, wasn't it? We'd crossed the border by that time.
Yes.
Absolutely right. And that we take the opportunity when we can to invite you in person. Because, I mean, I think your message should reach a much wider audience as well, and that would be, I think, a university session, which I know we have a rain check on. So we will continue the relationship. I'm sure colleagues may wish to follow up with you personally, and I know that you've
by all means, yes, please do.
I can certainly recommend The Other Schindlers as a read. I've read it myself when you first introduced me to it a couple of years ago. So Agnes, on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for the honour of spending a little bit of time with you to mark one day, which is Holocaust Memorial Day for this week.
Well, thank you so much, Craig. Yes, I remember the time we met, because actually I recognised you from the hotel, because I'd seen you in the hotel. We'd both stayed in the same hotel, and you schlepped my laptop case around the airport for me, for which I'll always be eternally grateful. And it was just one of those wonderful things that happen. And so I've been pleased to do this.
And any service I rendered to you in the airport has more than been repaid with our friendship since then. So Agnes, thank you so much for that, and I will call a halt to my colleagues. Thank you, colleagues, again for your participation, and I hope that's done what the Memorial Day should do, which is to give you a small opportunity this week to put aside and to remember. So, colleagues, thank you so much, and Agnes, thank you too for joining us. And
thank you to Stu for manning the
of course,
the PowerPoint. Yes, thank you very much.
Indeed.
Okay,
Thanks,
it's
Agnes.
been a great pleasure. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.